Hello, welcome to The Shift, Mondo Weiss's place to discuss U.S. politics and Palestine. On today's discussion, we'll be talking about two media moments from the past week that shows how Israel's place in our media landscape could be surprisingly shifting. But first, I'm Adam Horowitz, managing editor here at Mondo Weiss, and I am joined, as always, with our U.S. news correspondent, Michael Aria. Welcome, Michael.
Hi, Adam. Thank you.
You're welcome. For those who don't know, Michael does a weekly email newsletter called The Shift, which follows very similar issues to what we'll be discussing today and broader issues of U.S. politics in Palestine. So if you're interested in what we're discussing, please sign up for that newsletter. It comes out on Thursdays, and it is not to be missed. So, Michael, I should have also added, though, during my introduction of you, that in addition to being a politico, you are also a media analyst and have a long history of that. And this week, you wrote an article for us that we'll be discussing about Benjamin Netanyahu's visit to 60 Minutes. But first, we want to start with what is maybe one of the biggest stories, news stories, but also sort of brouhahas of this week regarding Israel, which was an article by Nicholas Kristof in the New York Times called "The Silence That Meets the Rape of Palestinians." And it was an in-depth, it was run as an opinion piece, but it is really an in-depth investigation of the systemic practice of the rape of Palestinians in Israeli jails. This is a story that Mondo Weiss has followed closely for years, especially since October 7th. We've run a number of stories sharing testimonies, direct testimonies of Palestinians who've been in Israeli jails and who have experienced rape and other forms of sexual violence. But this is not a subject that has been covered in the U.S. media until this week, when Nicholas Kristof talked to many of the same sources that we've talked to, same human rights organizations and survivors on the ground. As you can imagine, Israel responded to this story by absolutely losing its mind. And not just Israel, but Israel supporters in the US. I'm wondering if you could talk to us some about what were the reactions to this story?
Yeah, thanks. I would just begin by pointing out that I think, in addition to what you've already kind of laid out, I just wanted to point out that Kristof, in writing the story, relied on interviews, like you said, from multiple Palestinian victims, 14 Palestinian victims, which is, I just say to use as a segue, because some of the criticism has claimed that it was improperly sourced. But he actually talked to 14 people who had been in Israeli prisons. But having said that, yeah, there's been this kind of hysterical reaction across social media with a lot of pro-Israel accounts, a lot of pro-Israel organizations condemning this piece, condemning Kristof, condemning the New York Times, and a number of them also referring to this as a blood libel, the idea that he is writing about sexual assault and rape, and somehow the implication being that he is making a direct connection between that and Jewish people. I think, like mainstream groups like the American Jewish Committee have come out very strongly against this. And, groups like AIPAC have tweeted about it. The AJC has referred to it as inflammatory narratives and, that type of language. I think, we've also seen people within the Israeli government put statements out condemning it. So this is not just coming from like pro-Israel organizations. We have former Israeli prime minister sounding off. We had Israel's foreign ministries, whoever runs their social media, their foreign ministries' social media dismissed the columns. They invoked this blood libel idea, the idea of it being a blood libel trope. They wrote, "One of the worst blood libels ever to appear in the modern press." And
can I interrupt you for one second? Just because our listeners or people watching might not be even familiar with this term blood libel, which is just to put it in context, just the insanity of this charge. The term blood libel, within the Jewish community refers to, it's sort of like the core anti-Semitic charge that the Jewish community will make. It's sort of a term that refers to the supposed, the sort of the classic sort of Christian belief that Jews use Christian blood for the to make matzah during the Jewish holiday of Passover, and it's sort of the core ridiculous myth that is supposed to demonstrate what anti-Semitism is and what sort of annihilationist anti-Semitism is.
Yes.
Like it's the strongest charge of anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish hate that you can basically make to refer to something as as a blood libel. And here we have the Israeli Foreign Ministry tweeting that this article, and I'm going to read it directly. Today, the New York Times chose to publish one of the worst blood libels ever to appear in the modern press. Like, that was the exact line. So this reported story that directly quotes 14 Palestinians, as you say, like by name, including some of their photos in this article, with some of the most harrowing and disturbing and like painful to read descriptions of the torture that they received in Israeli prisons. The response from Israel and its supporters are that this is basically like just ridiculous hatred of Jews.
Absolutely, yeah. And connected to that, like you say, the very term blood libel, the idea of blood libel, like you say, has historically been invoked by, within the context of anti-Jewish pogroms, during in medieval Europe, and was a big part of Nazi propaganda targeting Jewish people in Europe. So the idea of invoking it is to equate, the New York Times or Kristof himself with, Nazis, people like, Hitler, Nazis, this long history of historic anti-Semitism. And I just thought the reaction was interesting. I think you wanted to talk about this too. I thought that in some of the responses I saw, and I know you mentioned this before we got on the call, it did seem like, although it was hysterical, there was not as much kind of pushback to the actual facts as you might expect. I mean, there's this idea that it could be that it's a blood libel. The foreign ministry, like you said, kind of declared that they were going to keep fighting this, whatever that means. The New York Times, we should point out, is standing, at least when we're recording this, it has been standing by Kristof and standing by his reporting, and have not, despite calls for him to be thrown under the bus, have not done that as of yet. We'll see how this ends up ending up, but to this point, it seems like they feel pretty confident in his sourcing and the reporting that he's done. He's been obviously a reporter for decades, but I just thought that was interesting. I don't know if you wanted to say anything about it, but even like there's a Jewish Insider piece today about kind of the backlash to this piece, which cites all the examples that we've already given, like the AJC and the foreign ministry. And one of the examples they give is this reporter, Michael Cohen, who's pro-Israel, who even his tweet is kind of like two things can be true at the same time. Kristof's piece properly highlights the horrible prison conditions for Palestinian detainees in Israel, which are well documented, while also leaning into arguments that are based on weak evidence from unreliable sources. So even some of the most prominent people condemning this and condemning the New York Times and calling it a blood libel, not that Cohen did that, but some of the people who do it in their public stances or their commentary on this, they're kind of acknowledging that some of it could, if not all of it, could potentially be true. They're not really disputing 100%. The facts.
100%. And for those who don't know, because you referred to Jewish Insider, which is an online publication, it's a publication that we read, Amanda Weiss, Michael, and I talk about, and it's a publication, if you don't know, that covers politics in the Jewish community. And honestly, it covers a lot of similar territory that Amanda Weiss covers from a very different perspective. I like to think of it as it's sort of like the Amanda Weiss Wario. We cover many of the same stories, but whereas, they think that like the growing pro-Palestinian support of the Democratic Party is a horrible thing, where we will be covering it as an interesting shift in U.S. politics.
Sure.
So just to say, that's where they're coming from. And even their coverage of this article, which was it was surprisingly muted in that they had several people talking about, well, obviously that there are issues that need to be addressed in the Israeli prison system. Which, if that's where they're starting their discussion of this article, then I would say that, Kristof's argument has been accepted by at least parts of the pro-Jewish, pro-Israel community in the U.S. I do have to point out one other of these like insane responses, because I think you mentioned it in passing, but also just to point out, so people are talking about anti-Semitism, people are talking about bread libels. Like, who do we look to? Like, who are the people that are sort of looked to try to distinguish about what is actually anti-Semitism versus what isn't? And this brings to mind Deborah Lipstadt, who was the anti-Zionism czar under the Biden administration. And her response to this article was to retweet a call basically comparing Nicholas Kristof in the New York Times to Julius Streicher and a Nazi propaganda, basically calling for Kristof to be like hung at Nuremberg, similar to what like Nazi propagandists were. And this is one of the people that was like in a Democratic administration talking about anti-Semitism. So just to say, like, one of the things that's interesting to me about this is, this very factual report was put out in the New York Times. The New York Times is standing behind this report. Nicholas Kristof has been just fending people off left and right on social media, defending his reporting, which seems incredibly solid. And then the Deborah Lipstadts and these sort of Israel lobbyists of the world have been coming out with these like extremely strong attacks, calling it anti-Semitic and a blood libel. But what feels different this time is that those attacks are going nowhere.
Sure.
Like in the past, that has led to, well, this article is going to be reviewed, or that this is that even like people are questioning the facts of the reporting. But in this time, that's not happening.
No, and just kind of the last thing I wanted to say about this was, if you look at the New York Times, I think most people who are watching this know that the New York Times has been terrible when it comes to reporting the issue that we report on every week.
Yes.
And there's so much documentation. There's entire books devoted to this very topic. And if people go into our archive and just look on the New York Times tab, they'll find dozens and dozens of articles documenting, the way that the New York Times has historically been not just pro-Israel, but anti-Palestine in so many different ways. So to highlight this article or to talk about Kristof and the backlash isn't to say that the New York Times is suddenly good when it comes to this issue. There's obviously like a boycott against the New York Times by many advocates of Palestine for its reporting for specific reasons. At the same time, I don't think you can deny that it remains, the quote unquote paper of record. It's the paper that, the establishment, for lack of a better term, still reads and still takes seriously. It still has a big readership. It's still the biggest of the mainstream papers in, printed papers in that way. And Kristof is a very popular figure. I mean, he's been praised by former presidents for his reporting. He's something of a progressive. I think he refers to himself as a progressive or a Democrat. He writes about human rights, usually in places like, China or Sudan. And the fact that he has written this piece, I think it is notable, and it does kind of connect to the things that we talk about here every week, where some of these views, or just, through the work of the movement for Palestine and, as you say, on our site, if people look it up, we have published dozens and dozens of pieces on this very topic long before somebody like Kristof ever took it up. That's not to say that people should read the New York Times instead of Mondoweiss. I think they should do the opposite. But the fact that it's being covered in the New York Times, and the fact that the backlash to it seemingly isn't going anywhere. The foreign ministry declares it's going to continue to fight it. But like you say, I don't really see that fight going very well based on what we've seen so far. I think this is a notable moment in that way. When we talk about the way that, Palestine and Israel is perceived in the mainstream media, it definitely points to the shift that we talk about here every week.
Yeah. And this is a point that you made earlier as well, but I think it's worth highlighting here. Nicholas Kristof tends to focus these types of human rights investigations not on U.S. allies, but typically U.S. adversaries. And so the fact that lens is now being shined on Israel, I think is another indication of what Israel's standing is, especially at least in the liberal media.
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah. So one of the reactions too that I've seen online from Israel and Israel supporters to this article was really, it was this sort of this like gobsmacked, this isn't how this is supposed to work. This isn't how we're supposed to be treated in the media. And there was another story this week that I think is maybe a little bit more what they're expecting when it comes to U.S. coverage. And that was Kristof's article appeared on Monday. On Sunday night here in the U.S., Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was interviewed on CBS News 60 Minutes, which is one of the leading, probably the most popular news show in the United States. You wrote an article about this interview. Please tell us about it. Why was Benjamin Netanyahu on 60 Minutes on Sunday?
So I back up a little bit just to say that since we published this article, there has actually been some news since we published it, which is there was an exclusive, that piece in the New York Post, I think it was today, that revealed that even the interview itself at CBS, Bari Weiss is CBS, as we know, she has been running CBS News for a while now. Netanyahu was able to negotiate who interviewed him. He ended up going with Major Garrett, who, longtime journalist there, who ended up interviewing him. But so that kind of sets the stage for what you just alluded to, where obviously Netanyahu is going to get kind of, an inviting environment. It's not going to be very critical. He's able to negotiate who he talks to. I think the reason he came on to your question is obviously because the war in Iran is going poorly. I don't even know what, you'd cite. You could cite any, recent story, whether it's gas prices or, the domestic numbers in terms of polling or in terms of, the U.S., what the stated U.S.-Israel objectives and what we've seen come of it so far. But it's very clear that not only is it starting to be regarded as an absolute debacle and a failure, but you're also starting to see, longtime advocates of these type of wars come out and criticize it. People like Robert Kagan in the Atlantic Monthly the other day writing a piece basically saying the war is lost, it's over. That stuff has been very interesting. So I think Netanyahu comes to 60 Minutes to talk for a long time. Within that context, he's there to sell the idea of the war, to push back against the idea that it's been a colossal failure. And he was allowed the space to do that with virtually no pushback. And that's what I would say, none actually, not virtually, none at all. I write in a piece this week that we put up at the site, like you said, I kind of ran through some of these preposterous claims that he made during this interview where Major Garrett pushes back on absolutely nothing. He claims, for instance, that Hamas, he repeats these, disproven statements about Hamas, the Hamas attack of October 7th, where he claims that people were beheaded, women were raped, babies were burnt. No response from Garrett whatsoever, despite so much documentation to that point. At this point, years later, he made the farcical claim that Israel is the most discriminating military on the planet in history, trying to suggest that despite the fact that he's been at the helm during a genocide, that they've said that Israel has done an unprecedented historic job at distinguishing between civilians and Hamas fighters, which obviously is not true in any capacity. He claimed that the Lebanon beeper attacks, I thought this was one of the craziest claims he made, that the Israel's beeper attacks on Lebanon in 2024 had no collateral damage, which we know is certifiably untrue, as documented by places like
Human Rights. Straight up lie.
Multiple people killed, including a child. And also, and this was the funniest claim, none of that stuff is funny, but he also claimed that in Iran, people refer to him as beloved Bibi. He said he doesn't know how to say it in Farsi, but that's what they refer to him as, and that they're trying to name streets after him there in Iran, the place that he's bombing. So he says all this stuff. He gets virtually no pushback. And my piece was kind of about how he's saying this at this amazing moment where, support for Israel has completely tanked among the U.S. population. This is only alluded to slightly during the interview at all, in kind of like the voiceover, like after it was produced. He is not challenged on that issue whatsoever. There was the recent, I think last week, right? We covered that, I thought, pretty historic letter from 24 House Democrats calling on the Trump administration to acknowledge the fact that Israel has had a stockpile of nuclear weapons, forever, and no one really talks about it. And he's not that is not brought up. He's able to repeat all these lies about Iran seeking weapons and developing weapons without any pushback whatsoever. He, at the end of this, what's incredible is at the end, Major Garrett says to him, something like, let's quickly get to Gaza. This is like an afterthought at the end of the interview. Let's quickly talk about this. Doesn't, ask about the genocide. Doesn't ask Netanyahu about the fact that there's a warrant out for his arrest for alleged war crimes from the ICC. So we have, Netanyahu allowed to speak for quite a while, tell all these lies, and get absolutely no pushback from 60 Minutes whatsoever. And not like 60 Minutes was ever great on this issue, or was formerly not pro-Israel, or they've always been pretty bad on this. But I think it just showcases, and that negotiation that they obviously had with Netanyahu going into it showcases kind of the current state of 60 Minutes, I think, and CBS more broadly under Weiss.
Yeah. And so just to say, that's in that story you're referring to that came out today, Bari Weiss gave Netanyahu a choice whether he would want to be interviewed by Lesley Stahl or Major Garrett. And he chose Major Garrett because he thought it would be an easier interview, which it seems like he got exactly what he wanted. And, everybody's familiar with the idea of a softball interview, but people never even can assume that you can actually choose the softball pitcher who's going to be like sending you those questions. So this is really an unprecedented example of Bari Weiss just trying to help Netanyahu however she can to try to win over a U.S. public that has completely soured on this. And one of the things that I think is interesting is, and this was Netanyahu's first interview he's given in the U.S. media since the war on Iran started, where he was trying to rally the troops to support him. And almost all the coverage coming out of this interview has been about how Bari Weiss is trying to expunge any critical coverage of Israel. I mean, one of the other stories that have come out recently is that Bari Weiss fired their London bureau chief, Claire Day, over her disagreements with coverage over the genocide in Gaza. And so whereas the plan might have been like Netanyahu's going to have this great platform to convince Americans to support this war, it seems like the only coverage coming out of this is all the ways that Bari Weiss has ruined any kind of journalistic objectivity at CBS.
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought up that Claire Day example, and you said disagreements. We should point out, but the reporting suggests that those disagreements are essentially boiled down to the fact that she was insufficiently pro-Israel, and that she was maybe giving too much, airtime or too much to the perspective of Palestinians or people engaged in that situation. The one thing I wanted to point out is that this was definitely a PR move by Netanyahu. He attempted to get out there in front of it and insist to the American people that everything was going fine in Iran. It was just a matter of time. Of course, he was asked about the timetable for the war, and he couldn't provide that. But this is an inherent contradiction also, which is that we've written about it quite a bit, but it's also this idea that these people like Netanyahu and Trump, they get in front of reporters and they claim on one hand that Iran is weaker than it ever has been before, that it's barely standing as a country, and yet it is so powerful and so committed to creating a weapon that we must stop it immediately. So it's these two kind of things at once that contradict one another. But I think one of the other interesting aspects here, when we talk about the PR battle and we talk about Netanyahu getting on here and talking in terms of public relations, is that he was asked about, and he spoke about at some length, if people look at the interview, an issue that we've talked about on the Video Shift podcast multiple times. I think we did a whole episode devoted to it a couple weeks ago. This issue of aid to Israel, where he said this in an Economist interview, but he reiterated in this interview with 60 Minutes that he wanted to get to a point where he essentially Israel weans itself off aid from the United States. And as we talked about before, when you actually look at the details of this, everything would pretty much stay the same in terms of the United States supporting occupation, genocide, apartheid. The only difference would be that Israel claims that it can adapt and be a little bit more financially independent, and that they don't have to take all these weapons and bulldozers and weapon systems from the United States for free. They can actually pay for some of them. So Netanyahu told Garrett that he wants to draw down to zero American financial support and the financial component of the military cooperation that we have. And as we've stated on this Shift podcast before, and we've written about it at the site. This in itself is like a massive PR move on the part of Israel, because they certainly understand that there's this antipathy that is developed among the U.S. population for the relationship with Israel, that many people are skeptical of Israel. And if you look at the Axios reporting, I think from a couple months ago on this, the Israeli government was already trying to, because their contract with the United States that Obama signed in 2016 is set to expire. Now they're already looking for America First tweaks. That report said that they're trying to sell the Trump administration on some sort of idea that isn't just Israel getting a blank check. And that's a direct response to the fact that many people on the right, and even within Trump's sphere, have grown a little skeptical of Netanyahu, or at least think that they should be paying their fair share, so to speak, and shouldn't be just getting money and weapons from the United States for free. So I thought that was another interesting aspect of the interview, that was, to me, like another kind of public relations move on Netanyahu's part to kind of assure the American people that, don't worry, your tax dollars won't be going directly to Israel. We have a whole idea set up where we're going to do this all ourselves. But I thought that was a very interesting part of the interview, and kind of dovetailed with his PR when it came to the other aspects of the war.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, this interview really served as this like sort of moment to check in on what case Israel is trying to make to the U.S. public to rebound or try to save the support that it's losing. And it seems as though this interview did not move the needle at all.
No, definitely not.
All right. Well, thank you for this, Michael. The war of ideas in the U.S. press seems to be pointing very much against Israel, and this is something that we will be continuing to follow for sure. So, thank you so much for the discussion today. Everyone, sign up for the Shift newsletter to follow our ongoing coverage. And next time when we talk, we will be checking back in on some of these political races around the country that we've been following that will be coming up for votes soon. So that should be interesting and exciting. Look forward to that.
Thanks, Adam.
All right. Talk to you soon.